My name is John Baer. I'm a professor of educational and developmental psychology at Rider University. I do a lot of creativity research, and I want to talk to you today about why I think you are probably more creative and perhaps also less creative than you think. But before we talk about creativity, I want to talk just for a moment about expertise. If someone asks you, are you an expert? You'll probably respond with your own question. Expert in what? And that's wise. But if people ask someone, are you creative? They tend to try to answer without asking that same kind of question, expert in what? But they should. The reason is creativity is very domain specific. And think for a minute about your own creativity. Are you equally creative in all the things you do? For most people, they're creative, very creative in some areas, a little creative in others, and not creative at all in some other areas. That you may be very creative when it comes to making Halloween costumes, or creative in designing experiments, or creative in cooking, or creative in poetry, but not creative in some of those other areas. Expertise is like that also, isn't it? I mean, if someone is an expert in Japanese literature, we don't assume they also know a lot about, say, the Krebs cycle. That's one way. Creativity and expertise are very different, but that's one way they're very much alike. They're very domain specific. That being creative in one area doesn't mean you're creative in some other area. Now, I hope that seems kind of obvious. I think it is. And yet it's something that we tend to forget a lot, including the people who make the so-called, I'm using scare quotes here, creativity test, because I'm going to try to debunk them in a minute, tend to forget. They treat creativity as if it's some special sauce, some spice you can add to anything you do to make it more creative, make it more imaginative. But that's not how creativity works. It's certainly true that some people are creative in lots of areas. Some people are creative in just a few areas. Expertise is like that also. Some people have lots of expertise. Some people have expertise in few areas. But that's what you'd expect if something is domain specific. We know this from our own experience introspecting, and we know it from thinking about other people's creativity, but we also know it from a lot of research studies done with a wide range of people, ranging from kindergarten kids, people older than I am, by lots of different researchers. What they do is they give people tasks like they ask them to make a collage, to write a poem, to come up with some interesting mathematical puzzle, to write a short story. And then you ask experts in each domain to rate those for creativity. And if you do that, you find three things. One thing, you find the experts tend to agree. The experts in art tend to agree which are the more and the less creative collages and so on. That's not surprising. The second thing you find is that creativity in a domain is fairly stable over time, that the people who wrote creative poems last year will be the ones who write the more creative poems this year in general. The third thing you'll find is that creativity in one domain doesn't predict creativity in other domains, that there's virtually zero correlation. That what you find is that creativity is very domain specific, and being creative and making collages doesn't predict how creative someone will be in writing poetry, or vice versa. Now, if creativity were a general trait or a general disposition or a general anything, that's not what you'd find. You'd find positive correlations among their performances in different areas. But that's not what you find because creativity is domain specific. So now you know, if someone asks you, how creative are you? Don't answer without asking, creative in what? But there are some larger points here. One is that we tend to judge our own creativity and others based on their creativity in very few domains. I've had students who tell me, Dr. Baer, I'm just not very creative. And I ask them why they think that. And they say, well, I'm not an artist, I'm not a poet, and it's true. They may not be creative in those areas, but I know these students, and I know when it comes to teaching, they're very creative. When it comes to resolving interpersonal conflicts, they can be very creative. When it comes to designing or interpreting research, they're very creative, but they think themselves not creative because they're not poets. Other thing we should get from this understanding of creativity being domain specific is to be wary of things that call themselves creativity tests. The most widely used tests of creativity are called the Torrance tests. They've been around for 60 plus years, I think. There are two forms of the test. There's a verbal test and a figural test. The verbal test, you do things with words like come up with lots of uses for an object like a brick. The figural test, you do things with shapes. Now, they're both measures supposedly of creative thinking in general. Think for a minute about other kinds of measurement. If I were going to measure your height, say, and I could measure it with a couple yardsticks, or I could measure it with a tape measure. But you'd expect that whichever method I used, I'd get about the same measurement. It might be off by a quarter inch, but you get the same measurement. You should expect that if you're measuring creative thinking in general also. But even Paul Torrance himself, the creator of these tests, found there's no correlation in scores between different forms of the same test. They may be predictors of creativity in very narrow domains, but they're not predictive of creativity in general. If creativity were a general trait, then it wouldn't matter which particular form of the test you took. So we should be wary of these tests of creative thinking, which are used in schools, and they're also used a lot in research, and that's where it becomes problematic. You shouldn't be able to change the result of creativity research based on which particular test you took of the same thing. But that's exactly what happens. As an example of this, a couple years ago, Newsweek had a cover story about the so-called creativity crisis, this huge crisis. The creativity was dropping in this country. Cover story in Newsweek. It was based on a study that showed there was decline in scores on one, not both, but on one of the two Torrance tests of creative thinking. Well, there might have been a decline on those scores in those tests, but that doesn't tell us about creativity in general. If you want to find out about whether creativity is increasing or decreasing, you need to look at actual things people do, and that's been done. And what you find is it varies depending on the domain. For example, Howard Gardner and Katie Davis at Harvard did a study a few years ago, just about 2 years ago, I think, which they looked at the creativity of adolescents over a 20-year period, roughly the same period as the creativity crisis. And they did it by looking at their visual art and short stories that have been published in a teen magazine called Teen Inc. It's been around for a long time. And so they had a 20-year sampling of teenagers' short stories, and a 20-year sampling of their visual art. And they gave these to experts to rate for creativity. And what they found was, in visual art, creativity increased during this period. In short story creativity, it decreased during the period. Because creativity is in general, it's domain specific. And because of that, we shouldn't think about our creativity as something we're creative or not. We're creative in this area, maybe not in that area. And I suspect that you're probably very creative in some areas, maybe not so creative in other areas, and that's fine. That we all have different kinds of creativity. Creativity is something we can express in every part of our lives and everything we do. And in the more areas we find ways to express it, it makes life that much more interesting. Thank you.